Let's talk about a few possible rules you may want to follow. Again, maybe not. First off, let's just talk about size. And this one should be pretty straightforward. If I come in here with a brush and I draw let's do that a little bit better, a big object and a small one. Which one feels like it has more visual weight? Probably that one, right? It's just bigger. Now, that means that one large object can usually balance out, let's make these a little bit better, balance out a bunch of little objects. They'll just feel better. They have more attraction to them. So at some point, if you keep adding little circles, you'll feel as though they have the same level of interest or attraction to them. You may start to look at them differently. So that essentially is just size. Larger objects, you don't need as many large objects as small objects to balance things out. So that's size. You can also have repetition. As I drop my mouse, just a moment, there we go. You can also have repetition. So for example, if you start repeating something again and again and again and again with as little variation as possible, then it will not be as interesting. It will be easier to blend into the crowd. And the more and more and more that you repeat it, the easier it is to not really notice it. So you can take advantage of that. So that when you do have something that sticks out from the crowd, all of a sudden, it will bring attention to itself. And it will become more interesting. So repetition is a way to provide a sort of background to what's going on. So if you don't want something to stick out, simply add more of it somewhere else. So if you have, for example, suddenly a splotch of green somewhere on your page and you keep looking at that even though you don't want to look at that because you may have some blue object that's supposed to be more interesting, add that green in a couple of other places. And all of a sudden, since it's not unique, it will be easier to ignore. So you've got repetition. Now, when you break up repetition, like we did with this triangle, and again, where's my mouse? Like we did with this triangle, then you have variation, and variation is interesting to see. By breaking it up, even if you have repetition with a couple of points in it, you'll see objects a little bit more differently. You'll start to sort of Where's Waldo it. You'll want to pick out those different objects from it. So you can control points of visual interest by having variation inside of something. Now, if you combine those two, variation and repetition, you end up with a rhythm. Let's go ahead and label these real quick, though. We have, again, size, repetition, and variation. Now, what if we were to combine repetition with variation? You end up with something called rhythm. Let me set that one up. So let's say you just had repetition going on, nice boring repetition. But let's say then you added some variation to that repetition. So you didn't get too bored from things. You added something in to be attractive. But then you did it in exactly the same sort of pattern. Well, now it's repetition, but it's repetition with variation. What do you get then? Well, that's rhythm. That's essentially a more complex version of repetition, and it may just be that you change certain things, or maybe you even add variation from time to time to it, just so that it becomes less boring as you go through. And there you go. You start to get some rhythm to things. And that's essentially rhythm. So how is rhythm useful? Well, if you have something that you want to break up like you were doing on variation, so that it's not boring like you have in repetition. So you have something boring like repetition, then you add variation, but now you have centers of focus. What if you don't want it boring like repetition? You don't want to push it back, but at the same time, you don't want to have it set so that there are certain things that you're looking at. Well, then you do rhythm. You start adding repeating areas of interest in it, so you lean more towards repetition than variation, or more towards variation from repetition. depending on the direction you're going. That way you're no longer having everything fade into the background, but you're also not pulling everyone to the same point. So it's sort of a middle ground, and that's rhythm. Now you also have contrast, which is something that we use in with the curves a lot. But in this case, you can use it with, well, anything. For example, if you have a dark shape, you may want to contrast it with a light shape. And if you have a big shape, you may want to contrast it with a small shape. And if you have a shape of little or no texture, you may want to contrast it with a shape of considerable texture inside of it. Now, that said, in order to maintain balance, you'll find that some things end up being stronger than others. As we were saying earlier, you may need quite a few small shapes in order to balance out a big shape. You don't need a whole lot of texture to balance out an area of not a lot of texture, and you don't need a whole lot of dark to balance out an area of light. So on that point, you need to watch out with balance. So balance are just those sorts of intuitive rules of when you need more of something or less than something. So I could put this all in lowercase, or I could make it like the others. Just a moment. So through experimentation, you'll find balance fairly straightforward. Like I was saying, if you have a little bit of texture, it'll balance out an area of not a lot of texture. So here I have about a quarter of it. But if we were to like divide this area out, it would still feel as strong as the rest of the area that it's around. If I were to instead build a couple of objects in here, a big one might need quite a few small ones to balance it out. Just so that, again, how many do you need? Well, you play with it and you'll start to see. If you have dark and light, again, you don't need a whole lot of dark to a whole lot of light. And let me demonstrate that one for you real fast. Yep. Now, the edge here is always interesting because it makes it feel as though there's more going on past the picture plane. So here's another piece of contrast to create balance. I've got all these pointy shapes, but I've got these big round shapes too going on here. So I don't have a whole lot of dark, but I can still achieve a sense of balance. Now, if I were to come in here with a ton of dark as compared to the light, would this feel particularly balanced? I don't think so. It'd feel like it's mostly dark. But you could make that a visual design element, of course, by doing something like this. Just kind of balance it out. That's actually another interesting point, the rule of odds. Now, the rule of odds essentially means that people prefer an odd number of things to an even number of things. So if, in order to avoid something feeling boring, let me show you. This will feel more boring than this. Now they're still symmetrical. We have something in the center and then we have something on either side. But just the addition of a new third element makes all of the difference. And you'll see this a lot. So if you start feeling as though your composition feels dull, try making sure that there's an odd number of elements in things. I always found that to be fascinating. It's just a human trait. And lastly, we have color, which you guys have been playing with quite a lot. And again, these are just some rules. You can look up a million different rules. I just wanted to make sure that you had a few at your disposal. And color, also, sometimes people fold value in here. essentially, this gets interesting. Warmer colors, reds and yellows, will feel closer than cooler colors, blues and some greens, that sort of thing. Let me come in here one more time. So if we were, for example, come in here and start adding in some cooler colors in the background, and then maybe some mid-range, well, what's between red and blue? Well, if we switch on over to, say, our LAB, we can see that we get these violets and purples. Depending on if we're in the cooler side or the warmer side, they'll come out quite a bit differently. So let's just do this in maybe 4 steps. One last thing. Got to have this at the top. Okay. All right, so it will feel as though things are getting closer the further away they get. Now there's also tone, and essentially it means this. There's something called atmospheric perspective. And all atmospheric perspective means is the further back something gets, the lighter it gets. So if we do something like this, and maybe if we want to be really good about it, we will go ahead and mask this out. Did that the wrong direction. There we go. So that we can truly have something good here. Okay, there we go. Now I can just lower the opacity, wrong one, on this one. No worries. All right, so the closer we get, the more opaque something becomes, essentially, and the further back, more transparent it becomes. And you can get that through essentially value, sometimes referred to as tone, but color itself has some rules to it. So let's say, for example, a little bit of dark will balance out a lot of light. So a little bit of a warm color can balance out a lot of cool color. Did I say that right? A little bit of warm can balance out quite a bit of cool. Let me just show you that. So let's say we start with cool. And again, if you bring up the color wheel, let's see, here we go. If you bring up the color wheel, essentially the cooler colors are over on this side, these blues and greens. Warmer ones are these reds and yellows. And of course, you've got these kind of purple orange colors in here. The orange ones, of course, are warm, but as you get into the purple, you can push it warmer or cooler. Same with the greens, you can make them warmer or cooler. But let's stick to flat out cool color real quick. Let's get really in there. Make that nice and cold. A little bit of red at the bottom should balance that out. In fact, we could probably do even less. Let me get this out of the way. There we go. Should feel more or less balanced to you. Now, I by no means am an expert in design. However, thanks to the written word, you can get access to that pretty easily. You can Google things around. If you're close to a library, it might be worth checking out a few books. Let me bring those up for you real fast. All right, here we go. These should be available at most libraries. There's Graphic Design Basics by Amy E. Arson. I can never say that right. Amy E. Arnitzen. And you don't need any particular edition. I don't know why they have the paperback at $50. That's insane. You get them used for like $4 or whatever, and there's some hardbacked ones. Look at this. It's like $7. That's great. But again, you don't have to buy these yourself if your library has them. The one recommended for this class was Picture This, How Pictures Work. And this was by Molly Bang. And I do recommend this one. It's like a 2-hour read for the whole book, and I think it's quite excellent. You have Byrne Hogarth's dynamic drawing series, which is a terrible way to put it. It's the Dynamic Light and Shade by Byrne Hogarth. And this guy is absolutely amazing. If you've taken an anatomy class or a figure drawing class and you feel as though your figures are a little stiff and you've wanted to be able to move them around in space better, you have Byrne Hogarth's dynamic anatomy, his drawing head, his figure drawing, his dynamic hands. They're excellent, but they are a little more advanced than the basic stuff. And again, libraries should have these. The one you're after, though, for layout principles and design principles, is most likely Dynamic Light and Shade by Byrne Hogarth. And this one, check this one out from your local library. Absolutely recommend this one. I've got one in my hands right now. This is Imaginative Realism, and it's by James Gurney. James Gurney has done covers for National Geographic. He's done stamps. He's done children's books. He has done it all. He has a section in this book called Composition, and it talks about a number of principles that many of the other books do not go over, such as two values, silhouettes, chiaroscuro, well, a lot of them do go over that. Shape welding, which is just attaching shapes so that they become one thing. Counter change, and even right here, counter change is the reversal of tonal relationships between form and its background that occur from one end of form to another. It's a useful way to generate the feeling of tonal movement. So in other words, if you had, just as a quick example for how brilliant this is, if you had a shape cutout. Let me do that real fast. Boom. Just get a selection there. If I take the gradient tool and then just flip this, say, black to white. If I Control-Shift-I, flip the selection, but also flip the gradient, you can end up, there we go. Except, of course, watch out for actually overlapping chunks, because you'll notice it disappears right when it overlaps. So you can fix that fairly easily by just adding a little bit of color to whatever's going on. So have the lights in the foreground, objects to the darks, and then flip it around to the other side. It goes over stuff like that. If you're curious about some of these, let me know, and I'll be happy to make a video about some more of these. But I feel as though, they've got stuff like the windmill principle and eye tracking and more heat maps, which we talked about a little bit. But if you want to hear more about it, let me know, and I'll be happy to talk about it some more. I feel as though these rules are probably enough to get you well on your way to balancing everything. I should also say one last thing that I do believe I missed on the way over to the end here. Some of these rules will make things seem closer or further away. And size is a great example. If you wanted to produce something that looked like it was close, just make it bigger, right? Then something that's further away, you just make it smaller. And all of a sudden you start getting those. And if you do something like overlap things, and I still have a selection going on, which is what's causing all of this oddity. So let me just deselect, Control-D. If you have an overlap going on, it will also seem as though there's some shapes to it. So you can create the feeling of things being closer or further just through overlapping and size. So that's something else we haven't really gotten into because it may not come up too much as you start applying your filter effects. But if you wanted to, not a problem. Like I said, there are just dozens of different rules for design, sets of rules for designs. It's fun to just grab a few of them and kind of work your way through them to see what you can get from it. But with this in mind, it's time to actually get into some of the filters. I'm going to start with a series on Liquify, and then we'll get into some individual filters. Then we'll walk through the project. Okay, I'll see you next video.